Hi there, I'm Oisin Lunny and welcome to iGaming Next Spotlight with the mighty Mkodo. Our Spotlight session today is going to be looking at some really interesting topics like geolocation, legislation, triangulation, trilateration and much, much more with Stuart Godfree, who is the Managing Director at Mkodo. Now, a lot of you, myself included, have known this company for a very long time. They've been around in the iGaming business, well known, well respected, and they're well known as mobile technology and geolocation specialists. So I'm absolutely thrilled to have Stuart here to help us navigate, no pun intended, this incredibly important area. Welcome, Stuart.
Thank you, Oisin. Hello, everyone.
Fantastic. Hello, everyone, indeed. Right, and we are now going to just dive straight in, but it'd be great, I think, to get some of that flavour for what is the Mkodo story. How long have you been around? Obviously, it's been a long time, as long as I've been in the industry, and many people will recognise you and many of your colleagues. So talk to us a bit about the Mkodo history. Who are some of the big names that you worked with, and what's some of the expertise that you provide?
Yeah, sure. Let me just give you the kind of classic elevator pitch. So we started as a business in 2001, and we were talking about it a little bit earlier. Oisin, I had hair then, and so that goes to show how long we've been in this industry and what it's done to me. We actually started off in the B2B text messaging industry and worked with some major brands like Turner Broadcasting, Disney, NBC, all the major brands. And one of our clients asked us to start developing mobile websites, which is what we do. We build a platform, and in those days, mobile websites was something called WAP for those old people who remember WAP, The biggest problem with WAP was that the browsers were very, very unsophisticated, and you had to basically render everything server side for the client. You had to understand what the mobile phone was to render the right level of content. And we developed that technology really well. In fact, ironically, we still use some of that technology in our platform today. And then we got a referral by one of our partners whether we could build a sportsbook betting site for a company, and that was Rank Group when they had a brand called Blue Square. I'm sure a lot of people in the industry remember the Blue Square brand, which eventually was taken over ultimately by what is now called Flutter. So we built this sportsbook, and we went into it quite naively, to be brutally honest. It was kind of, we can build a sportsbook, and suddenly realised, my goodness, what a complex product mobile or any sportsbook actually is. But we built it and became very successful and became quite well known in the industry as being a sportsbook provider. And then that took us into more broader areas. We'd always been developing Scion-based apps for historical reasons, and that took us into the Symbian market. And then, as most of you probably know, again, the older people in the audience will remember that Nokia, as a really good example, was on the Symbian platform, and their kind of market somewhat disappeared in 2007 when a particular white phone arrived on the market. Yes. and a bit like Polaroid killed their business almost overnight. Wow. And then we started getting into app development, and we were building sportsbook apps, and one of our very first apps that we ever built and put into App Store was a bingo product, again for the Rank Group under the Mecca brand, and that launched in 2010. And the thing that we had to develop for that was a geolocation platform. So one of Apple's requirements was that any gambling product can only operate in the jurisdiction that they have the license for. So in 2009, when Apple said we're going to open up the App Store, we started developing our geolocation platform. So it goes back all the way to 2009 and was first operational in early 2010. So that's kind of the background, and from that one app, we've become specialists in apps for iGaming, sportsbook, and particularly lottery, where we're very strong. We build a lot of lottery apps and have most of the Canadian market for lottery.
Wow, that's really impressive. I mean, it's a great pedigree, it's a great history. You have been doing this stuff since day one, literally when the App Store opened. And I remember those days well, heading over to Mobile World Congress in Cannes when WAP meant something completely different, the Cardi B famous song that's changed the definition somewhat these days. But talk to us a bit about, one of the most exciting markets on the planet, North America. It's absolutely kicking off there, and they've got very special legislation. They've got requirements around geolocation. So talk to us a bit about the landscape there. What should people be thinking about?
Yeah, so North America. So there's two obviously parts of North America. There's Canada and the US, and don't get them confused. They both get quite upset if you confuse one to the other. But the key one in Canada, obviously, is Ontario. It's the first regulated open market in Canada. There's various views that other jurisdictions or provinces, as they are technically called, may open up in Canada. But for now, it's Ontario, and there's a lot of people who are trying to get into that market. What we're actually seeing is there's a lot of European operators who are trying to see if they can actually make something work in Canada, and almost using it as a kind of gateway province before they head into the US, which has considerably more rigor in the way that you operate. And I have to say, one of the things I mentioned a little while back in one of my LinkedIn posts is that what I'm seeing in the United States is a much more significant level of rigor in responsible gaming than I'm actually seeing in Europe. And I think that is quite a good indicator very much of some of the things that we've seen quite recently, with certain operators being fined quite considerable amounts of money, both for their customer care and also money laundering controls as well. So. Yeah. But what we're also seeing in the US is something quite significant. They have some quite interesting legislation in there, one of which is something called PASPA. Most people probably have heard of it, but PASPA was brought in 1992 to protect amateur sports people from basically game rigging. Okay, so the idea was that you couldn't bet on an amateur sport, and therefore an amateur sports person couldn't be influenced by money or whatever to match fix. Now, the trouble with PASPA, it kind of morphed into professional sports as well. So effectively, in the US from 1992, it was illegal to bet in the US on a sporting event, and technically PASPA was any sports-orientated event, so it could almost be anything. Now, that fortunately was repealed in 2018, and has opened up that side of the market. So betting on sports is now technically legal in the US from the PASPA point of view, but there's something even more confusing, which it takes a while to get your head around. But in the US, they brought something in called the Wire Act, and that was brought in 1961. And basically, it was illegal to conduct any sort of betting activity over the telephony and orchestrated telephony network in the US. Now, the idea behind that was actually quite meritable. It was the idea was to stop people, because if you think about it, the United States is a pretty wide country, okay, from north to east. So it meant that somebody who was in a sporting event on the eastern side of the US probably had, and was actually at the sports ground, probably had better insight into what was going on than a betting establishment on the West Coast. So the idea was that you couldn't transfer betting knowledge between two people, east to west. So in other words, if I was sitting in a baseball ground in the East Coast, I could call my friend and get him to place a bet in San Francisco, and therefore he would have better knowledge, or I would have better knowledge than my bookie would. So that created a problem. And basically what the Wire Act said was you couldn't conduct betting activities out of state. And that got quite confusing of what actually out of state really meant. So technically, betting in state has always been allowed, but it's always been very confusing. So providing you were placing a bet in state with an operator in that same state, irrespective of actually where the sports event was technically legal. technically legal. But there's been lots of kind of to's and fro's within various courts within the US to make judgments on whether that is the case. Now, what that actually meant was, and still means to a very good degree, is that kind of definition absolutely is rigid. So in other words, I can only place a bet with my chosen operator while I'm in that state. Okay. So that's where the geolocation compliance comes in. So we have to absolutely guarantee that that person is in that state, placing that bet with that operator who has that jurisdictional license in that state.
Wild. Okay, so the market is really opening up. We've got these very important pieces of legislation that are still in force today. They're evolving. There's benefits to the consumer in there in terms of protection, but also the technology has to be really on point. But people expect a kind of borderless e-commerce experience and the user experience to follow them everywhere. How do you square that circle between the legislation focusing on a specific state and people wanting like a multi-state wallet or a multi-state brand relationship?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So it's because there's actually two parts of the whole geolocation piece. One is compliance, and one is tax dollars.
Oh yeah.
And of course, one could argue, that there are some organisations who probably are less concerned about compliance and more concerned about tax dollars than the others. But the way it works is quite interesting. As an operator, you may have, and there are a number of these organisations now who have what we call multi-state licenses. So they have a licence for their brand across multiple states. Mm-hmm. And that means technically a customer can have a single operator account. In other words, so I have an account with operator X, who they operate in multiple states. Okay. And basically what that means is we have to have something that we call a portable wallet.
Okay.
Or a transferable wallet. And what that basically means is that when I'm in one particular state in the US, I log in and my wallet is in that state. I then travel to another legitimate state. I will actually need to log back in again. It would automatically log me back in again. But my wallet that was in the previous state will be transferred into the current state that I'm in. Okay. So we call that portable wallet, and again, of course, geolocation is really important because we need to know where you are and to make sure your wallet is moved into the correct legitimate jurisdictional state. Okay. Now, what is really interesting about that is actually how all the money is transferred. So effectively, my wallet is still kind of operating in my previous state because any winnings that I make, that I hope I make, will get put into that wallet, and any tax liabilities and any tax payments that the operator may have to pay gets managed in that particular state. The state I'm now in, when I'm place a bet, all the tax responsibilities and liabilities I have while in that state get applied. And any winnings that I make will go into that wallet, irrespective, in fact, whether I'm in that state or not at that particular time when the winning event occurs. So what's really important is that, that's all tracked. As you can see, the sophistication of managing a system like that is quite significant. And what we're actually seeing is there's only a couple of platform providers who currently have that technology. So the way that a number of platform providers are doing this, they just have systems in each location. And although a user has one account, it's just basically duplicated across each one of those. So it's not exactly a smooth movement across, and monies do kind of get tied up in particular states. So if you just pop into one state and you only go there once a year, your winnings kind of sit in that, and you can only access them if you go back to that state, which is clearly not particularly great for the user. You want to be able to use your winnings wherever you are.
Wow. And as a friend of mine likes to say sometimes when we go out for a drink together, what could possibly go wrong? I mean, I think that's a good question to ask in terms of tax responsibilities for the operators and also regulatory compliance. I mean, you spoke about the end user experience there, but what could the impact be for the operators, say, if that geolocation doesn't work, the multi-state wallet is not as sophisticated as it should be? I mean, these are kind of existential level dangers, I would imagine.
Yeah, so So what's quite interesting is that because of the Wire Act, particularly the responsibility of ensuring that a user is in that state that they say they are is down entirely to the operator. Now this actually differs in Canada, whereas Canada's a little bit more flexible, and if you are saying you're in one state and you're actually not, and you're using code or various components or methods to avoid your location being accurately portrayed, that actually is considered to be fraud in Canada. And sits on the end user rather than sits on the operator. Now, under sports betting in the US, it's kind of, we don't care whether somebody's fraudulently trying to tell you they're in one location when they're actually in the other. The responsibility of ensuring that they are sits entirely with the operator. So the operator has a large amount of risk that they have to deal with, and therefore, clearly, they want to use a platform that is reliable and effectively guarantees that the person is where they say they are. And one of the biggest challenges we always have is the what we call distance to boundary, or distance to the provincial or the state border. And it's that crossover piece that we have to be very, very careful of, because somebody could be traveling, for example, in the car. Highly unlikely they're going to be in an airplane, by the way. But if they're in the car, how quickly do we check their location as they transgress the border? But ultimately, the responsibility of ensuring that sits with the operator, and that their liability therefore sits with their regulator. So it's crucial that we get the location right, and we make changes to the system dynamically as the closer they get to any form of jurisdictional border.
Absolutely. I mean, those are some big risks there for operators, in particular in the American market. But talk to us a bit about, the best possible strategy. How should operators be looking at this? How should they look at, implementing geolocation? You've been doing this for a long time. What kind of advice would you have for anybody watching this and just, feeling the blood drain out of their face?
Well, I mean, it's classic. Like if you're not really very clear about something, then go and ask for advice. Okay, that's always is what it sounds. There's a number of operators or platform providers within geolocation in the market now. Speak to all of them and make sure that you're comfortable with them. But one of the things that I always say to people is that, and I have this thing that one shoe does not fit all, and that geolocation services have to be relevant to the compliance model inside the jurisdiction that you're operating in. So the kind of good news is that iGaming, for example, doesn't come under the Wire Act. Okay, so therefore the absolute level of responsibility for location is slightly less aggressive for iGaming than it is for sports. You could go, why? But that is the case. So iGaming, you don't have to have quite the level of sensibility that you do for sportsbook. So think about that. So if you're only an iGaming provider in the US, then potentially your geolocation rigor can actually be reduced. Okay. And as I say to a lot of my prospects and customers, if you're playing in Ontario, don't implement a US Wire Act centric geolocation platform, because number one, you don't need to, and number two, it kills the user journey.
Oh yeah. Wow. So
the user journey becomes very difficult, and particularly in Ontario, where it's quite a competitive market, you've got to have as few speed bumps as you possibly can in the user journey to get people to log in and authenticate, etc. So if you make that very painful, people will just migrate to another platform that makes their life easier. And we've been very lucky, because we've been operating with Ontario Lottery Group for a number of years. They actually use our platform, and so we have a lot of learnings on what is the best and least best way of getting location, and how frequently people will refuse location, and how you kind of triage them and get them back to authorize their location so they can play inside that province. So my general view on everybody is, one solution doesn't fit every single jurisdiction, and it also doesn't fit every single type of operation. As I say, if you're sportsbook, it's got to be tough. If it's not, then you can moderate the level and the sophistication of the location checks that that you need to do. And just quickly finishing up on that, it's not just also the geolocation checks that the regulators are often interested in. It's other aspects of how people might be subverting the geolocation platform. And this is a real tricky one because we kind of need to understand what sort of tooling you have on your device. But we also have to balance that with privacy regulations. Now, Canada has very, very similar privacy regulations to what we have in Europe. We have this wonderful thing called GDPR, which I know we all love, and Canada has kind of got something similar. The US privacy rules are quite difficult, but they sit fundamentally underneath ultimately their constitution. So although they don't have the clarity of definition that we do in Europe, they actually have potentially more far-reaching privacy in the way that it's considered under their jurisdiction. So generally, privacy controls in America are very difficult to understand because effectively they're proven in law, in a court of law, rather than proven by a piece of documentation laid down in front of you. Right. So we have to be really mindful about how much information we're sucking out of a person's device to understand whether they are trying to defraud us from their location position.
Wow, it's such a fine balancing act between, preventing fraud, being aware of all the different contexts, like if it's in the EU, North America, Canada, as you say, many different requirements. Is it iGaming? Is it gambling? Is it land? All these different kind of things go into the mix. But you kind of mentioned there at the very beginning the importance of speaking to a number of different providers. Is that extended to actual implementation? Do you think it's important to work with different companies depending on the context? What's your kind of view on that landscape there?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, Mkodo is. We're certainly not new to the geolocation marketplace, but we are also new to the geolocation marketplace. And let me just quickly explain that. We've been providing our geolocation services to the clients who use our apps and our web apps for 13, nearly 14 years now. But we haven't marketed as a separate solution. The only way you could get Mkodo's geolocation product is to buy Mkodo's or leverage us to have your app or your web app for your lottery or your sportsbook or your iGaming platform. 2 years ago, we decided actually that we were sitting on something that was quite valuable. A number of people in Ontario came to us and said, can we have your platform? And so we said, well, actually, yes, why shouldn't you? So we've now branded our geolocation services as Geolox. It's a separate product. We now have a separate team running that business. It's completely separate as a business unit to our other side of our business, trying to make it not so we don't kind of compete against ourselves in that space. And so, yeah, absolutely. I think anybody who's moving into this market, speak to a number of vendors. It's also, to some degree, it's the maturity. This, I'm bound to say this is hard stuff. Don't do it yourself. Of course I am, because I sell the product. In the same way I wouldn't say make your own car. But yes. But the important thing here is that you do definitely need, as a business, need to shape something, and you need to shape something that allows you to operate across multiple jurisdictions. Hopefully you'll choose one partner. But there is also one thing that I need to mention. There is also this concept of the Darwin effect, in as much that if everybody just uses one partner, then that product won't really ever evolve. It will become quite staid because there's no reason for innovation. Yeah. So the great thing I think actually about this market, and although as a kind of significant company operating in this market, I don't want to see prices crash. Of course not, because I'm a business person. But fundamentally, having a level of competition in the market does several things, I think, for the market overall. It innovates the market. We've seen that with any market that has multiple players, you get innovation. The second thing, of course, is that you get a level of price stabilization. That's a PC word for basically saying it pushes the price down. There's competition in the pricing, right? And that can only be good for the operators ultimately. And what you'll do is you'll get a balancing out of really what the value proposition of these services are. And the other thing is, I think what it will also do is it will give operators the more choice from an operational integrity point of view. Without saying names and things, there was a really good example about just over 2 months ago now, and there's a number of significant sporting events going on, and one of the major geolocation providers in the market, their systems went down. Now, they didn't go down for very long, but unfortunately they went down at a relatively crucial point, and nobody could place a bet because nobody could get geolocated.
Wow. Wow.
Now, if there's only one dinosaur in the field,
Yes.
And it's susceptible to a very simple flu, you can see what happens. So having a level of kind of spreading your bets across a series of operators clearly is a good idea. But what also that does is it evolves the product. Our platform, for example, is highly scalable, and it has multiple availability zones. It sits on AWS, and we use a minimum of 3 availability zones. So our likelihood of going down is hopefully 0. We offer the same level of SLAs as banks provide cash points.
Wow.
Okay, which is what we call 4 nines and a half, 99.995, right? So that's the type of thing now that we're all starting to innovate. We're starting to provide much higher quality of services because there's competition. We have to stand out in the market. Our competitors have to do the same thing. It can only be good ultimately for the customer.
Yeah. Well said. It's again back to that fine balancing act between legislation, regulation, customer experience, an optimized kind of on ramps for players, all this kind of stuff. But let's kind of step back a bit and go under the hood. Talk to us a bit about the current state of play with the technology that's providing geolocation. Kind of what are you seeing from your perspective?
Yeah, so I think. Right at the very beginning, you mentioned something. I have a pet peeve, if I'm allowed to say a pet peeve. And a lot of people... So I'm a technologist fundamentally, and my background is actually electronics. And I actually come from a radio electronics background. So I get a bit pet peeved about people talking about something called triangulation and cell tower triangulation. Yeah. And anybody who says the word triangulation and cell towers, they don't know what they're talking about. Okay, so as soon as you hear any geolocation partner talking about that, it means they fundamentally don't actually understand the business that they're operating in. There is no such thing as triangulation on cell towers. Now, there's lots of reasons for that, but basically, in very, very simple terms, when you have a radio signal, you can triangulate on a radio signal, and I'm sure we've all seen the kind of World War II movies where you've got the enemy radioing in on the team, and they've got these funny little aerials, and they've got trucks all over the place. And that's how you triangulate. You need at least 3 positions to listen for a radio signal, and then basically you on top of that area you have a compass. You take a bearing, and you can triangulate that in. Now, if I have my mobile phone, it's just me. Okay, I can't triangulate on a cell tower. I need at least another 2 people with compasses and bearings to triangulate onto a cell tower. It doesn't exist, right? That's not how it works. Plus the fact, actually, that your mobile phone doesn't have a directionally sensitive aerial in it. And if you think about it, why should your mobile phone have a directionally sensitive? It's in your handbag, it's in your pocket, it's not oriented to the cell, it's just sitting on the desk. For example, my mobile phone is sitting next to me now, and I have no idea where the cell is. It's just sitting there. So actually, we actually use something to find out where the cell is using something called trilateration, and that's based on signal strength. Okay, and it's still pretty bad because, again, with trilateration, I can work out how strong my signal is, but I would probably need to then find out what the strength of another cell tower is. What's actually known in the industry as a neighbour. So the cell that you're on is your primary, and anything out around it is called the neighbour. Now, none of that really works very well, to be honest. And basically, the way that geolocation actually works is there's a number of what we call instruments on your mobile phone or your laptop or even your PC that aggregate a load of information together. They send that information to a geolocation service provider. So these are Apple and Google and a thing called Bing, if you're old enough to remember Bing. Okay.
Indeed.
And what they do is they take all that data and then they deduce a location, and they provide that location back as an API, as a programming interface to your mobile device or to your laptop or to your PC. Wow. And that's the geolocation data that we then fundamentally get, we validate, and we send to our middleware servers. So that's how it works. So complex, and anybody wants to speak to me more about that over a pint of beer, very happy to, and that's probably the best way to leave it.
Do you know what? That's actually the perfect ending, because I was standing here thinking, oh, this is so complex. You're kind of opening up all these, cans of worms, and it gets more and more complex. But, I know that you provide very simple onboarding. You provide the tools. People can just implement it. You look after all of the science bit in the background. And it really is a fantastic experience for the operator, for the end user. And, when you get that magic happening, everybody wins. So listen, thank you so much to Stuart Godfree, Managing Director at Mkodo, for that really informative deep dive on geolocation for iGaming Next Spotlight.
Thanks, Oisin. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for joining us.